Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of medieval history that textbooks never tell you about. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring something that will make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. What really happened when medieval prisoners tried to escape their stone tombs? The answer involves more blood, desperation, and cunning than any Hollywood movie dares to show. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to discover why most escape attempts ended, not in freedom, but in punishments so brutal they redefined the meaning of suffering. Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Picture this. You're lying on mouldy straw in a stone cell so cold that your breath creates clouds in the darkness. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and death fills your nostrils with every laboured breath. Your ribs are showing through paper-thin skin because the rat bread they've been feeding you contains more bone fragments than actual grain. The water seeping down the walls tastes like copper and despair. This was reality for countless souls trapped in medieval dungeons across Europe. But here's what's truly chilling. Many of these prisoners weren't hardened criminals. They were political inconveniences, religious dissidents, or simply people who owed the wrong person money. Some had been waiting years for trials that would never come, while others knew their confessions had already been extracted through methods that would make modern interrogators sick. The psychological warfare began the moment that final door slammed shut. Medieval prison architects weren't just building storage spaces for humans, they were crafting instruments of mental destruction, those sloped floors that made you constantly fight for balance, the echoing corridors that amplified every scream and moan, the false acoustics that made you question whether those voices were real or just your sanity finally snapping. All of it was deliberately designed to break your mind before your body gave out. But here's where human resilience becomes absolutely fascinating. Despite facing what seemed like certain death, prisoners began to plot. They started counting guard rotations in the endless darkness, memorizing every stone, every crack, every weakness in their stone tomb. The decision to attempt escape wasn't born from hope. It was born from the mathematical certainty that staying meant death, while escaping offered even a fraction of a chance at life. These weren't impulsive decisions made in moments of panic. These were calculated risks made by people who had nothing left to lose except the few remaining days of agony that awaited them in those deliberately soul-crushing chambers. What pushed these prisoners over the edge wasn't just the physical torment, but the realization that they had become completely invisible to the outside world. In medieval society, once those dungeon doors closed behind you, you ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Your family might never know what happened to you. Your name would be scratched from records, your property seized, your very existence erased as if you had never drawn breath on this earth. The breaking point often came when prisoners witnessed what happened to others who had given up hope entirely. They watched fellow inmates scratch desperate prayers into stone walls with their fingernails until their fingers bled, then eventually stop eating altogether, choosing starvation over the endless cycle of suffering. Some prisoners would spend their final days carving maps of routes they remembered from their journey to the prison, creating elaborate escape plans they knew they'd never have the strength to attempt. Others would methodically count days by scratching marks into the walls, only to lose track when fever or despair clouded their minds, leaving behind incomplete tallies that told stories of broken spirits and shattered hope. But then there were those who channeled their desperation into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that kept their minds sharp even as their bodies wasted away. These prisoners understood that medieval justice was arbitrary and cruel, but they also recognized that medieval security was often surprisingly lax. Guards grew complacent, assuming that starving, weakened prisoners posed no real threat. Dungeon architecture, while psychologically brutal, was often retrofitted from wine cellars and storage rooms, meaning structural weaknesses existed for those clever enough to find them. The most successful escape attempts weren't born from sudden bursts of hope, but from months or even years of careful observation and meticulous planning. Prisoners would study the habits of rats moving through the walls, listening for the telltale sounds that indicated hollow spaces or connecting passages. They learned to distinguish between different types of footsteps echoing in the corridors above, identifying which guards were lazy, which were cruel, and which might be susceptible to bribery or manipulation. Some discovered that certain times of day brought different acoustic properties to their cells, allowing them to communicate with prisoners in adjacent chambers through barely audible whispers that carried through cracks in the stonework. The decision to attempt escape ultimately came down to a simple but terrifying calculation: die slowly and forgotten in this stone tomb, or die quickly while fighting for even the smallest chance at freedom. For many, it wasn't really a choice at all. Chapter 2: Mapping the Prison. Once that fatal decision was made, prisoners transformed from broken victims into methodical strategists, their survival instincts sharpening to an almost supernatural degree. The first step in any escape attempt was creating a mental map of their prison, a process that could take months or even years, depending on how much freedom of movement they were allowed. Prisoners learned to navigate their world through sound, touch, and the faintest variations in air currents that might indicate passages or openings they couldn't see. The architecture of medieval prisons worked both for and against escape attempts. While the psychological design was meant to break spirits, many dungeons were hastily converted from existing structures, creating unexpected opportunities for those observant enough to notice them. Former wine cellars retained drainage systems that connected to underground networks. Old storage rooms often had service passages that builders had simply walled off rather than properly sealed. Some prisons were built into castle foundations where ancient Roman construction lay beneath medieval additions, creating a maze of forgotten tunnels and chambers that even the guards didn't know existed. Prisoners developed an almost mystical ability to read their environment through the smallest details. They learned to distinguish between the echo patterns of solid walls versus hollow spaces by tapping gently with their knuckles during the loudest parts of the day when guards were least likely to notice. They memorized the exact number of steps between their cell and various landmarks, counting under their breath during the rare occasions when they were moved for interrogation or punishment. Some prisoners even learned to track the movement of guards by studying how dust motes danced in whatever slivers of light penetrated their cells, understanding that air currents changed when doors opened and closed in distant parts of the building. The most valuable intelligence came from observing guard behavior patterns over extended periods. Experienced prisoners could predict shift changes down to the minute, identify which guards drank heavily and might fall asleep on duty, and recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a guard was distracted by personal problems or romantic entanglements. They learned to distinguish between the footsteps of different guards, understanding that some walked with military precision while others shuffled carelessly, information that could mean the difference between successful stealth and immediate discovery. Communication networks between prisoners became incredibly sophisticated, despite the apparent isolation of individual cells. Inmates developed elaborate systems of coded tapping on walls, synchronized coughing patterns, and whispered conversations during the brief moments when guards were absent from certain corridors. Information about guard schedules, architectural weaknesses, and potential escape routes spread through these networks like medieval intelligence operations, with each prisoner contributing observations to a collective understanding of their prison's vulnerabilities. The most dangerous part of mapping a medieval prison wasn't gathering the information, it was storing it without getting caught. Prisoners couldn't risk writing anything down or creating physical maps that guards might discover during cell searches. Instead, they developed extraordinary feats of memory, creating elaborate mental palaces where every detail of their prison's layout was stored using techniques that would impress modern memory champions. Some prisoners would assign specific memories to different stones in their cell walls, creating a tactile filing system where touching a particular spot would recall detailed information about guard rotations or architectural features. The challenge became even more complex when prisoners realized they needed to account for seasonal changes and special circumstances that altered normal prison routines. During winter months, guards might patrol less frequently due to harsh weather, but they might also be more alert due to increased heating costs, making them worry about fires. Religious holidays brought different guard schedules, and periods of political tension could mean increased security or, conversely, distracted guards focused on external threats rather than internal prisoners. Prisoners learned to identify the telltale signs of structural weakness that medieval builders often inadvertently created. Mortar, mixed during certain weather conditions, didn't set properly and could be gradually loosened over time. Stone joints that weren't properly sealed allowed moisture to seep through, eventually weakening the connections between blocks. Some prisoners discovered that certain types of limestone used in construction could be slowly dissolved using acidic substances like fermented urine, a process so gradual that guards wouldn't notice the damage developing over months or years of patient work. The most valuable information often came from understanding the human element of their captivity. Prisoners mapped not just physical spaces but emotional landscapes, learning which guards were susceptible to flattery, which ones harbored secret sympathies for certain types of prisoners, and which ones might be bribed with promises of future rewards if they ever escaped and regained their freedom. They studied the personal relationships between guards, identifying rivalries, friendships, and romantic entanglements that might be exploited to create distractions or opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, successful escape planners learned to think like medieval architects and understand the practical limitations that governed prison construction. Drainage was always a concern in underground spaces, which meant there had to be ways for water to exit the building. Ventilation was necessary to prevent the accumulation of deadly gases, which meant air had to flow through the structure somehow. Food and supplies needed to be brought in regularly, creating predictable patterns of movement and access that observant prisoners could study and potentially exploit when the time came for action. Chapter 3. The Tools of Freedom, Segment 1. Armed with detailed knowledge of their prison's layout and routines, prisoners faced their next monumental challenge, acquiring the tools necessary to transform their escape plans from desperate dreams into deadly reality. In a world where guards searched cells regularly and prisoners were stripped of anything remotely resembling a weapon, creating effective escape tools required levels of creativity and resourcefulness that bordered on genius. The most common improvised tools came from the prisoners' own bodies and the meagre possessions they were allowed to keep. Human bones, particularly from fellow inmates who had died in captivity, could be sharpened against rough stone walls to create surprisingly effective cutting implements. Fingernails were deliberately grown long and then hardened by repeated scraping against stone, turning them into miniature chisels capable of gradually working away at mortar joints between stones. Some prisoners discovered that their own teeth, when deliberately loosened through malnutrition, could be removed and shaped into small picks capable of manipulating simple lock mechanisms. The crude eating utensils provided to prisoners became the foundation for elaborate tool-making operations. Wooden spoons could be slowly carved into lockpicks using nothing but patience and the rough edges of stone walls, a process that might take months but produced surprisingly sophisticated instruments. Metal implements, when they were available, represented treasure troves of potential. A single iron spoon could be gradually filed down against stone to create multiple tools, picks for locks, small chisels for mortar work, and even primitive saws capable of cutting through wooden barriers. Perhaps most ingeniously, prisoners learned to weaponize the very materials their captors used to contain them. The iron chains and shackles meant to prevent escape could be gradually weakened through repetitive stress at specific points, creating breaks that appeared accidental, but were actually carefully planned structural failures. Some prisoners discovered that the metal fittings on their chains could be removed and reshaped into surprisingly effective tools, using techniques passed down through whispered conversations between inmates who had spent years perfecting their craft. The process of creating these tools required not just ingenuity, but extraordinary patience and stealth. Work could only be done during specific times when guards were absent or distracted, and prisoners had to develop ways of concealing their progress that went far beyond simply hiding physical objects. They learned to disguise the sound of their work by timing it with external noises, like thunderstorms, celebrations in the town above, or the regular activities of guards. Some prisoners became so skilled at this clandestine manufacturing that they could continue their work even while appearing to sleep, using their bodies to muffle sounds and their blankets to hide the subtle movements required for tool creation. The most successful tool makers understood that their creations needed to serve multiple purposes while remaining completely undetectable to guards during routine searches. This necessity for concealment led prisoners to develop hiding techniques that were nothing short of miraculous. Tools were secreted inside body cavities, sewn into the seams of clothing using threads pulled from their own garments, or embedded in the mortar of cell walls where they could be retrieved when needed. Some prisoners learned to hollow out sections of their wooden bowls or cups, creating secret compartments that could pass casual inspection but held vital escape implements. The most paranoid inmates developed multiple hiding spots for the same tool, ensuring that if guards discovered one cache, backup options remained available. The acquisition of materials often required establishing complex trading relationships with other prisoners and even corrupting certain guards. Prisoners learned to identify which guards might be susceptible to bribery, often using information about their personal lives gathered through months of careful observation. A guard struggling with gambling debts might be convinced to smuggle in a piece of metal in exchange for promises of future payment. Guards with drinking problems might trade useful materials for information about where to acquire better alcohol. Some prisoners even discovered that certain guards could be manipulated through appeals to their religious beliefs, convincing them that helping prisoners escape was actually a form of Christian charity. The most sophisticated tool-making operations involved multiple prisoners working in coordination across different cells. One inmate might specialize in acquiring raw materials, while another focused on shaping and sharpening implements, and a third concentrated on creating hiding spots and distribution networks. These operations required levels of trust and communication that seem almost impossible given the circumstances. But desperation created bonds between prisoners that transcended normal social barriers. Prisoners also learned to create tools specifically designed for different phases of their escape attempts. Lockpicks needed to be delicate and precise, capable of manipulating the crude but effective mechanisms used in medieval locks. Cutting tools required different properties, needing to be strong enough to saw through rope or thin metal, but small enough to remain concealed. Some prisoners created specialized digging implements, designed for specific types of stonework or earthwork they expected to encounter during their escape attempts. The psychological aspect of tool creation was almost as important as the physical process itself. The act of making escape tools provided prisoners with a sense of agency and purpose that helped them maintain their sanity during the darkest periods of their captivity. Many prisoners reported that the hours spent carefully crafting their implements were among the few times they felt truly alive, their minds focused on something other than despair and suffering. The tools themselves became talismans of hope, physical proof that escape remained possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. However, the greatest challenge wasn't creating the tools, but knowing when and how to use them effectively, because a single mistake would mean not just the failure of their escape attempt, but punishment so severe that death would seem merciful by comparison. Chapter 4: Secret Tunnels and Ancient Drains. The spectre of brutal punishment made prisoners incredibly selective about when to reveal their most precious secrets, particularly knowledge about the hidden passages that honeycombed beneath medieval fortifications, like arteries in a massive stone body. These weren't simply random structural features, but remnants of centuries of construction, renovation, and the practical necessities of medieval life that builders often forgot to properly seal when converting spaces into prisons. The most valuable intelligence came from prisoners who had lived in the area before their incarceration, men and women who remembered when certain buildings served different purposes and who understood the practical requirements that governed medieval construction. Former castle servants knew about the networks of passages used to move supplies without disturbing noble households. Previous merchants understood how goods were transported through underground routes during harsh winters or times of siege. Some prisoners had even worked as builders themselves and possessed intimate knowledge of shortcuts and compromises the construction crews had made decades earlier. The mysterious figure known as Wrath, mentioned in prison, Whispers represented a particular type of valuable prisoner, someone who had spent years mapping not just their own prison, but understanding how different fortifications connected through forgotten infrastructure. Roth understood that medieval builders rarely created entirely new drainage systems when they could adapt existing Roman engineering, which meant that many prisons unknowingly sat atop ancient networks that stretched far beyond their visible boundaries. These underground routes weren't pleasant pathways to freedom, but treacherous mazes filled with deadly hazards that could kill escapees just as effectively as executioners' axes. Ancient drains accumulated centuries of debris, creating blockages that could trap prisoners in spaces barely large enough for their bodies. Sewage systems carried diseases that could kill within days of exposure. Some passages had been deliberately collapsed by previous builders, creating false routes that led to dead ends or sudden drops into flooded chambers where prisoners would drown in the darkness. The most experienced escape planners understood that accessing these tunnels often represented the most dangerous part of their entire attempt. Cell floors weren't randomly positioned, but were usually built over solid foundations, specifically to prevent prisoners from digging downward. Breaking through required tools capable of cutting stone, knowledge of exactly where to dig to avoid detection, and the physical strength to move heavy debris while weakened by months or years of malnutrition. Some tunnels required prisoners to crawl through spaces so narrow that getting stuck meant certain death, as rescue would be impossible and discovery would result in being sealed inside permanently. Others were partially flooded with water of unknown depth, forcing prisoners to make desperate decisions about whether to risk drowning or turn back to face certain execution. The darkness in these passages was absolute, making navigation dependent entirely on touch and sound, with wrong turns potentially leading to underground chambers that had been forgotten for centuries. Yet despite these terrifying obstacles, the underground networks represented the only realistic hope for prisoners whose escape routes above ground were completely blocked by guards, walls, and the watchful eyes of townspeople who would report suspicious activity in exchange for rewards. The key to successfully navigating these subterranean mazes lay in understanding the logic behind their original construction and the patterns that governed medieval engineering. Roman drainage systems followed predictable principles based on gravity flow and practical maintenance requirements, which meant that experienced prisoners could make educated guesses about which directions would lead toward freedom and which would trap them in dead ends. Water always flowed downhill toward rivers or natural drainage points, so following the subtle slopes in ancient tunnel floors could guide escapees toward exit points beyond prison walls. The Romans also built their systems with regular maintenance access points, which meant that successful tunnel routes often featured periodic chambers where prisoners could rest, change direction, or even find alternative pathways if their primary route proved impassable. The most successful tunnel escapes required careful timing that took into account seasonal water levels and weather patterns. Spring floods could transform navigable passages into death traps, while winter freezing might create ice barriers that blocked access entirely, but also reduced the likelihood of pursuit by guards unwilling to follow prisoners into frozen underground networks. Some prisoners waited months or even years for optimal conditions, understanding that patience could mean the difference between successful escape and drowning in a flooded tunnel system. Communication with other prisoners became crucial for gathering intelligence about tunnel conditions and exit points. Inmates who had attempted previous escapes, even unsuccessful ones, possessed valuable information about specific hazards, passable routes, and the locations of barriers or collapses that might not be obvious until prisoners were already committed to dangerous passages. This information was traded like precious currency through the whispered networks that connected different parts of the prison, with successful intelligence gathering often determining which prisoners had realistic chances of survival. The psychological challenge of tunnel escapes was almost as daunting as the physical dangers. Prisoners had to overcome claustrophobia, navigate in complete darkness while already weakened by captivity, and maintain hope despite being surrounded by centuries of decay and death. Many tunnels contained the remains of previous escape attempts, grisly reminders of the fate that awaited those who made wrong choices or lacked the strength to complete their journeys to freedom. Some prisoners developed elaborate mental preparation techniques to steel themselves for tunnel escapes, practicing breathing exercises that would help them remain calm in confined spaces, memorizing landmark systems that would help them navigate without light, and building physical strength through secret exercises designed to prepare them for crawling through narrow passages while carrying minimal supplies for survival on the outside. The most experienced escapees understood that successfully reaching a tunnel was only the beginning of their challenge, because the real test lay in emerging somewhere beyond the reach of their captors, and beginning the equally dangerous process of building new lives while constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Chapter 5. The Night of Escape. The transition from planning to execution marked the most terrifying moment in any medieval prison escape, when months or years of careful preparation had to be compressed into a few hours of precise, silent action, where a single mistake would result in capture, torture, and death. Successful escapees understood that timing was everything, and they waited for specific combinations of circumstances that might occur only once or twice per year. Moonless nights during religious festivals when guards were distracted, severe weather that would muffle sounds and discourage pursuit, or periods of political upheaval when prison security might be compromised by external concerns. The actual escape began hours before any physical movement, as prisoners performed final preparations that had to be completed in absolute silence. Tools were retrieved from their hiding places and carefully tested one final time to ensure they hadn't been damaged by moisture or discovered during searches. Improvised ropes made from braided clothing or bedding were checked for weak points that might snap under body weight. Any supplies that could be carried were gathered and secured in ways that wouldn't create noise during movement through narrow passages or while climbing walls. The psychological preparation was equally crucial, as prisoners had to overcome months or years of conditioning that had taught them to remain passive and submissive. They needed to transform themselves mentally from victims into predators, channeling desperation into focused aggression that would carry them through moments when fear might otherwise paralyze them. Many successful escapees reported entering almost trance-like states during their attempts, their minds focused so intensely on immediate survival that they temporarily forgot about pain, exhaustion, and the overwhelming odds against their success. The first phase typically involved breaking out of their individual cells using tools and techniques they had developed over extended periods. This might mean picking locks with improvised instruments, removing stones that had been gradually loosened over months of patient work, or exploiting architectural weaknesses that had been carefully studied and prepared. The work had to be done in complete silence, as even the smallest sound could alert guards and result in immediate discovery. Some prisoners had practiced these movements so many times in their minds that they could perform complex operations entirely by touch, never needing to see what their hands were doing in the darkness. Navigation through prison corridors required intimate knowledge of guard patrol patterns and the acoustic properties of different spaces. Escapees moved during precisely timed intervals when they knew corridors would be empty, counting steps in the darkness to ensure they were following memorized routes toward their intended exit points. They had to avoid areas where their footsteps might echo, dodge patches of light that could reveal their silhouettes, and time their movements to coincide with external noises that would mask any sounds they couldn't completely eliminate. The most dangerous moments came when prisoners had to pass through areas where guards were stationed, requiring levels of stealth that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. These encounters with guards represented moments of pure terror where prisoners had to rely on skills they had developed through desperate necessity rather than formal training. Some escapees learned to move with such fluid silence that they could pass within arm's reach of guards without being detected, controlling their breathing to eliminate even the whisper of air movement, and positioning their bodies to avoid creating shadows that might catch peripheral vision. Others discovered that guards could be distracted or incapacitated through careful manipulation of their environment, using thrown objects to draw attention away from escape routes, or exploiting guard weaknesses like drunkenness or romantic preoccupations. The transition from indoor spaces to outdoor areas created entirely new categories of danger and opportunity. prisoners who had spent months or years in dark cells often found themselves temporarily blinded by even minimal outdoor lighting, requiring precious time to adjust their vision while remaining hidden from potential observers. Weather conditions that had seemed favorable from inside their cells might prove treacherous in reality, with rain making surfaces slippery and dangerous, wind carrying sounds farther than expected, or cold temperatures sapping strength from already weakened bodies. Scaling prison walls, or navigating through tunnel systems, tested physical capabilities that had been severely compromised by captivity. Many prisoners discovered that malnutrition and lack of exercise had left them unable to perform feats of strength or endurance that would have been routine before their imprisonment. Improvised climbing equipment made from bedding or stolen materials often proved inadequate under real conditions, forcing escapees to make desperate decisions about whether to continue with failing equipment or turn back to face certain punishment. The underground portions of escape attempts created unique psychological challenges as prisoners found themselves in environments that were simultaneously more or less terrifying than their cells. While tunnel systems offered concealment from guards, they also presented absolute darkness, unknown hazards, and the constant possibility of becoming lost in passages that might extend for miles beneath medieval settlements. Some escapees reported losing all sense of direction and time while crawling through ancient drainage systems, unsure whether they were moving toward freedom or deeper into underground mazes where they would die alone and undiscovered. Navigation through these subterranean networks required prisoners to rely on senses they had developed during their captivity, while adapting to entirely new types of terrain and obstacles. They followed air currents that might indicate connections to surface areas, used their sense of touch to identify different types of construction that could guide them toward older or newer sections of tunnel systems, and listened carefully for sounds that might indicate proximity to populated areas where they could orient themselves geographically. The physical demands of tunnel travel often exceeded anything prisoners had experienced during their captivity, requiring them to crawl through spaces barely large enough for human bodies while carrying whatever supplies they had managed to gather. Chapter 6. When guards discovered empty cells, those supplies became precious lifelines during underground journeys that could stretch for hours or even days, as escapees discovered that freedom was not a destination, but a process that required constant adaptation to new challenges and dangers. The moment prison guards discovered empty cells, however, everything changed from a desperate bid for freedom into a deadly game of pursuit, where medieval authorities deployed resources and methods that transformed entire regions into hunting grounds for escaped prisoners. The initial discovery typically occurred during routine head counts or meal distributions, when guards expected to find prisoners in their usual locations and instead encountered empty cells with clear signs of escape attempts. The guards' immediate response followed established protocols that had been developed through centuries of dealing with prison breaks, beginning with securing the prison to prevent additional escapes, and quickly escalating to mobilizing extensive networks of hunters, trackers, and informants throughout the surrounding countryside. Medieval authorities understood that escaped prisoners represented threats not just to public safety, but to the entire social order that depended on the perception that justice was absolute and escape was impossible. Word of successful prison breaks could inspire other prisoners to attempt their own escapes, encourage criminal activity by demonstrating that punishment could be avoided, and undermine the authority of nobles whose power partially depended on their ability to maintain control over their subjects through fear of consequences. The manhunt machinery that sprang into action within hours of discovering escapes was surprisingly sophisticated and efficient, drawing on resources that extended far beyond the immediate prison staff. Local militia units were mobilized to patrol roads and search known hiding places throughout the region. Professional trackers, often including hunters who specialized in pursuing both animals and humans, were hired to follow physical evidence left by escaping prisoners. Networks of informants that included merchants, innkeepers, and religious officials were activated to watch for suspicious strangers or unusual activity in their communities. The pursuit methods employed by medieval authorities were designed to exploit the weaknesses that escaped prisoners inevitably possessed after months or years of captivity. Malnutrition and physical weakness made it difficult for escapees to travel quickly or cover long distances, creating opportunities for mounted pursuers to overtake them, even when prisoners had significant head starts. Lack of resources meant that escaped prisoners often had to steal food, shelter, or clothing, creating trails of evidence that experienced trackers could follow for days or weeks after initial escape attempts. Bloodhounds and tracking dogs represented particularly terrifying elements of medieval pursuit operations, as these animals could follow scent trails that were invisible to human searchers and pursue escapees across terrain that would slow or stop mounted hunters. The dogs were trained specifically for hunting humans, and were often more persistent and effective than any other pursuit method available to medieval authorities, capable of tracking prisoners through forests, across streams, and even through urban areas where human scents might otherwise be masked by larger populations. The psychological warfare component of medieval pursuit operations was equally devastating, as the physical tracking methods, designed to break the spirit of escaped prisoners and make them more likely to surrender voluntarily rather than continue their desperate flight. Authorities deliberately spread rumors about the severity of punishments awaiting recaptured prisoners, ensuring that local populations understood that helping escapees would result in their own imprisonment or worse. Public announcements described gruesome details of torture methods that would be applied to captured prisoners, creating an atmosphere of terror that made potential allies reluctant to risk their own safety by providing assistance to desperate fugitives. The financial incentives offered for information leading to recapture were carefully calibrated to appeal to different segments of medieval society, while ensuring that escapees could trust no one during their flight. Poor farmers might be offered enough money to feed their families for months in exchange for reporting suspicious activity in their areas. Merchants could receive tax relief or trading privileges for cooperating with manhunts. Even religious officials, despite their supposed commitment to mercy and sanctuary, often found themselves compromised by authorities who threatened to withdraw support from their institutions unless they cooperated with pursuit operations. Geographic knowledge became a crucial advantage for medieval authorities, who possessed detailed understanding of local terrain, weather patterns, and seasonal conditions that could be exploited to predict likely escape routes and establish effective ambush points. They understood which roads prisoners might use to reach neighboring kingdoms, which forests offered concealment but also contained natural barriers that could trap fugitives, and which rivers or mountain passes represented choke points where small numbers of guards could intercept large numbers of potential escape routes. The coordination between different jurisdictions created networks of communication that could track escaped prisoners across vast distances, with messages traveling between nobles, religious authorities, and military commanders at speeds that often exceeded the pace of fleeing prisoners. This medieval intelligence network meant that prisoners who believed they had successfully evaded immediate pursuit often found themselves walking into carefully prepared traps in areas they thought were safe, as information about their movements had preceded them through official channels. Weather and seasonal factors were systematically exploited by pursuit operations, with authorities timing their searches to take advantage of conditions that favored hunters over prey. Snow made tracking easier while making travel more difficult for weakened prisoners. Harsh winter conditions forced escapees to seek shelter in predictable locations where they could be more easily discovered. Spring flooding might block escape routes while creating opportunities for authorities to position guards at bridges or fords that prisoners would be forced to use. The most sophisticated pursuit operations involved psychological manipulation designed to exploit the mental state of escaped prisoners who were already traumatized by their captivity and terrified by their desperate circumstances. Authorities would deliberately allow some prisoners to believe they had successfully escaped, then recapture them after they had led pursuers to accomplices or revealed information about escape networks that could be used to prevent future attempts. This practice created an atmosphere of paranoia among prisoner populations where successful escapes were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as inmates wondered whether apparent success stories were actually elaborate traps designed to gather intelligence about future escape plans. Chapter 7. Recapture and Brutal Punishment. The elaborate deception tactics employed by medieval authorities created an environment where even successfully reaching apparent safety could instantly transform into the most dangerous moment of an entire escape attempt. as prisoners who thought they had achieved freedom discovered that their every move had been anticipated and manipulated by pursuers who possessed resources, knowledge, and ruthlessness that far exceeded anything the escapees could match. When recapture finally occurred, whether through betrayal, exhaustion, or superior tracking methods, the consequences were designed not merely to punish individual prisoners, but to serve as horrific examples that would terrorize other inmates and discourage future escape attempts through demonstrations of suffering so extreme that death would seem merciful by comparison. The punishments began immediately upon recapture, often before prisoners were even returned to their original places of confinement, as guards and authorities understood that swift, visible consequences were essential for maintaining the psychological control that prevented mass escape attempts. Public beatings in town squares served multiple purposes, demonstrating to local populations the fate that awaited those who defied authority while providing opportunities for crowds to participate in the punishment through jeering, throwing objects, or suggesting additional torments that authorities might inflict. These spectacles were carefully orchestrated to maximize both physical pain and psychological humiliation, with specific attention paid to breaking the spirits of recaptured prisoners in ways that would be visible to other inmates when they were finally returned to their cells. Branding represented one of the most common and effective punishment methods, serving both as immediate torture and permanent marking that would identify escaped prisoners for the rest of their lives, making future escape attempts infinitely more difficult by ensuring that their criminal status would be immediately apparent to anyone they encountered. The brands were applied using red-hot iron implements shaped into letters or symbols that indicated specific crimes, with escape attempts typically marked by distinctive patterns that informed observers about the prisoner's history and the level of supervision they required. The branding process itself was designed to maximize pain through slow application of multiple marks, often accompanied by other tortures that prevented prisoners from losing consciousness and missing the full experience of their punishment. Physical mutilation served similar purposes, while also reducing the practical capabilities of prisoners who might attempt future escapes, with specific punishments chosen to address the methods used in particular escape attempts. Prisoners who had picked locks might have their fingers broken or removed, while those who had climbed walls could expect damage to their hands or feet that would prevent similar attempts. Some authorities favored cutting tendons that controlled fine motor skills, leaving prisoners capable of basic movement but unable to perform the delicate manipulations required for tool-making or lock-picking. The most sophisticated punishment regimens involved graduated escalation designed to extract maximum information about escape networks while ensuring that the psychological impact on other prisoners was sustained over extended periods. Initial torture sessions focused on immediate pain and visible damage, followed by periods of apparent mercy that allowed prisoners to hope for clemency, then renewed punishment that was more severe than anything that had come before. This cycle could continue for weeks or months, with authorities carefully managing the process to ensure that prisoners remained conscious and aware throughout their ordeal, while other inmates were forced to witness the consequences of escape attempts through sounds, smells, and occasional visual evidence of what awaited them if they chose to risk their own attempts at freedom. The institutional memory of medieval authorities regarding escape attempts created increasingly sophisticated punishment protocols that evolved over centuries of dealing with prisoner resistance, incorporating lessons learned from previous cases and adapting to new methods employed by increasingly desperate inmates who understood that failure meant consequences beyond imagination. Guards developed detailed knowledge of which punishment methods were most effective for different types of prisoners, understanding that nobles required different approaches than commoners, that religious prisoners might be broken through spiritual torture rather than physical pain, and that repeat escape attempts demanded escalating severity that would finally convince even the most determined individuals that death was preferable to continued resistance. Permanent imprisonment modifications represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating category of punishment, involving alterations to prisoners' living conditions that would make future escape attempts literally impossible while serving as constant reminders of their failed attempts. Prisoners might be chained permanently to walls, using methods that prevented any significant movement, sealed into cells that were smaller than their previous accommodations, or placed in locations specifically designed to eliminate any possibility of communication with other inmates who might provide assistance or emotional support during their continued captivity. The timing of punishments was carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact on prison populations, with public aspects scheduled during periods when maximum numbers of inmates would be forced to witness the consequences of escape attempts. Authorities understood that the sounds of torture were often more effective than visual evidence for breaking the spirits of potential escapees. So punishment sessions were conducted in locations where screams would carry throughout prison complexes and serve as constant reminders of what awaited those who dared to challenge their captivity. Some punishment regimens involved deliberate psychological torture designed to break prisoners' minds rather than simply their bodies, using methods that left physical capabilities intact while destroying the mental resilience and planning abilities necessary for future escape attempts. Prisoners might be subjected to sensory deprivation that eliminated their ability to track time or maintain their sense of reality, exposed to constant noise that prevented sleep and interfered with their capacity for coherent thought, or placed in environments where they were forced to witness the torture of other prisoners without being able to help or communicate with them. The documentation of punishments served multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping, creating institutional knowledge that could be referenced for future cases, while also providing detailed descriptions that could be shared with other prisons to ensure consistent approaches to escape prevention. These records often included specific details about which methods had been most effective for breaking particular types of prisoners, information about escape techniques that had been discovered and defeated, and recommendations for architectural or procedural changes that might prevent similar attempts in the future. Recovery periods between punishment sessions were carefully managed to ensure that prisoners remained conscious and aware of their suffering, while preventing death that might end their ordeal prematurely and reduce the psychological impact on other inmates. Medical knowledge, limited as it was in medieval times, was applied specifically to sustain prisoners through extended torture sessions that might otherwise kill them before maximum deterrent effect had been achieved. This medical intervention represented a particularly cruel aspect of medieval punishment, as healing was provided not for mercy but to enable continued suffering over longer periods than would otherwise be possible. Chapter 8. The Few Who Made It. The calculated cruelty of medieval punishment systems makes the rare stories of successful escapes all the more remarkable, representing triumphs of human determination and ingenuity against overwhelming odds that were deliberately stacked to make freedom seem impossible and death appear to be the only realistic outcome for prisoners who dared to challenge their captivity. These exceptional cases of successful escape attempts provide glimpses into the extraordinary resourcefulness, luck, and timing required to overcome the sophisticated pursuit and punishment systems that medieval authorities had developed over centuries of dealing with desperate prisoners who had nothing left to lose except their lives. The most successful escapees shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from the vast majority of prisoners who attempted freedom, but ended up recaptured and subjected to horrific punishments that served as warnings to others contemplating similar attempts. These individuals possessed detailed knowledge of local geography that allowed them to navigate towards sanctuary locations beyond the immediate reach of their captors, often drawing on memories from their lives before imprisonment or information gathered through careful questioning of other prisoners who had traveled extensively before their own captivity. Physical conditioning played a crucial role in successful escapes, with prisoners who managed to maintain some level of strength and endurance during their captivity being far more likely to survive the grueling physical demands of escape attempts that might require climbing walls, crawling through tunnels, swimming across rivers, or walking long distances while avoiding main roads and populated areas where they might be recognized and reported to authorities. Some prisoners developed exercise routines that could be performed secretly within their cells, using bodyweight exercises and stretching techniques that helped preserve muscle tone and cardiovascular fitness, despite the debilitating effects of poor nutrition and limited movement. The timing of successful escapes often coincided with external events that distracted authorities or created opportunities that would not normally exist during periods of routine prison operation. Wars, Natural disasters, political upheavals, and religious festivals all created circumstances where normal security procedures might be relaxed, guards might be reassigned to other duties, or pursuit resources might be diverted to address more pressing concerns than escaped prisoners. The most successful escapees learned to recognize these opportunities and position themselves to take advantage of favorable circumstances that might occur only rarely during their captivity. Support networks outside the prison walls proved essential for prisoners who managed to escape their immediate captivity, but still needed assistance to reach true safety beyond the reach of medieval pursuit systems. These networks might include family members who had maintained loyalty despite the social stigma associated with having imprisoned relatives, religious officials who believed in redemption and second chances, or criminal organizations that viewed successful escapees as potential assets worthy of protection in exchange for future services or information about prison security systems. Sanctuary locations represented the ultimate goal for escaped prisoners who understood that temporary freedom meant nothing unless they could reach places where medieval pursuit systems could not easily follow them. Monasteries and convents offered traditional sanctuary rites that were recognized even by secular authorities, though the protection they provided was often temporary and conditional upon the escaped prisoner's willingness to embrace religious life permanently. Foreign kingdoms might provide refuge for prisoners whose original crimes were political in nature, particularly if they possessed information or skills that could be valuable to rulers who were enemies of their original captors. The transformation from escaped prisoner to protected refugee required navigating complex social, legal, and political systems that were often as dangerous as the original pursuit operations, since successful escapees had to convince potential protectors that they were worthy of the significant risks involved in harboring fugitives from medieval justice systems that did not recognize limitations on their authority to pursue and reclaim escaped prisoners regardless of time or distance. The process of establishing new identities involved more than simply adopting different names, requiring escaped prisoners to develop convincing personal histories that would withstand scrutiny from suspicious authorities while learning new skills, customs, and behaviors that would allow them to blend into unfamiliar communities without attracting the attention that might lead to their discovery and return to captivity. Religious sanctuary represented the most common form of successful refuge, but the protection it offered came with strict conditions that effectively ended prisoners' previous lives and required them to embrace entirely new existences within monastic communities that demanded absolute obedience, permanent residence, and dedication to spiritual pursuits that might be completely foreign to their previous experiences and beliefs. The nuns who provided refuge in the original transcript represented typical examples of religious communities that viewed assistance to desperate prisoners as expressions of Christian charity, but their protection was contingent upon escaped prisoners' willingness to abandon their previous identities completely and accept lives of religious devotion that were often as restrictive as their original imprisonment. The psychological adjustment required for successful integration into sanctuary communities often proved as challenging as the original escape attempts, since prisoners who had spent months or years focused entirely on gaining freedom suddenly found themselves in environments that demanded different types of compliance and submission. Many successful escapees reported experiencing severe depression, anxiety, and identity confusion as they struggled to adapt to circumstances where their hard-won freedom was circumscribed by new rules and expectations that felt almost as confining as their original captivity. Physical recovery from the effects of prolonged imprisonment could take months or years, with successful escapees often discovering that malnutrition, disease, and torture had caused permanent damage to their bodies that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Monastery infirmaries and convent healing centers provided medical care that was often superior to anything available to common people in medieval society, but the healing process required patience and acceptance of limitations that might prevent former prisoners from ever fully recovering their previous physical capabilities or returning to the types of work and activities they had known before their imprisonment. The constant fear of discovery never completely disappeared for successful escapees, even those who had reached apparent safety in religious communities or foreign kingdoms that seemed beyond the reach of their original captors. Medieval pursuit systems were persistent and far-reaching, with networks of informants and agents that could operate across vast distances and maintain surveillance for years after initial escape attempts. Some successful escapees lived their entire remaining lives in fear of betrayal, recognition, or political changes that might eliminate the protection they had achieved and return them to the justice systems they had fled. The knowledge and experience gained through successful escape attempts sometimes transformed former prisoners into valuable resources for other inmates who were planning their own attempts at freedom, creating underground networks of information and assistance that connected different prisons and prisoner populations across medieval Europe. However, participation in these networks carried enormous risks, as authorities were constantly searching for evidence of organized escape planning and would subject anyone suspected of providing assistance to punishments that were even more severe than those applied to the actual escapees themselves. Chapter 9. Life After Prison. The underground networks that connected successful escapees with prisoners still trapped in medieval dungeons represented some of the most dangerous and sophisticated criminal organizations of their time, operating with levels of secrecy, coordination, and mutual support that rivaled the intelligence networks employed by nobles and religious authorities who were constantly searching for evidence of organized resistance to their control systems. These networks required former prisoners to balance their desire to help others achieve freedom against the enormous personal risks involved in maintaining contact with active escape operations that could expose them to renewed pursuit and capture by authorities who never stopped searching for prisoners who had successfully evaded their justice systems. The process of building new lives while constantly looking over their shoulders created unique psychological challenges for successful escapees, who had to learn to function in normal society while suppressing the hypervigilance, paranoia, and survival instincts that had enabled them to survive their imprisonment and escape attempts. Many former prisoners found it impossible to sleep soundly, eat regular meals, or trust other people, their minds permanently altered by experiences that had required constant alertness and readiness for violence or flight. The simple act of walking through populated areas could trigger panic attacks as former prisoners instinctively scanned crowds for potential threats, searched for escape routes, and prepared for the pursuit they expected would eventually find them. Employment opportunities for successful escapees were severely limited by both their physical conditions and the need to avoid occupations that might expose them to official scrutiny or bring them into contact with authorities who might recognize them or become suspicious of their backgrounds. Many former prisoners were forced to accept work that paid poorly and offered no security, laboring in conditions that were often as harsh as their original captivity, but without the hope for escape that had sustained them through their imprisonment. Agricultural work in remote areas provided relative safety from discovery, but required physical capabilities that many former prisoners no longer possessed due to permanent damage from torture, malnutrition, and the effects of prolonged confinement. The social isolation experienced by successful escapees was often as devastating as their physical hardships, since they could never risk forming close relationships that might lead to questions about their backgrounds or create emotional attachments that could be used against them if their true identities were discovered. Many former prisoners reported feeling more alone after their escape than they had felt during their imprisonment, when they had at least shared their suffering with fellow inmates who understood their circumstances and could provide emotional support during the darkest periods of their captivity. Marriage and family life presented particular challenges for successful escapees, who had to decide whether to risk the emotional vulnerability of intimate relationships while knowing that discovery could endanger not only themselves, but also their spouses and children who might face punishment for harboring fugitives. Some former prisoners chose to remain celibate and solitary for the rest of their lives, viewing emotional connections as luxuries they could not afford, given the constant threat of discovery and recapture that hung over their existence. The financial resources required to maintain false identities and avoid detection often forced successful escapees into illegal activities that increased their risks of exposure, while also compromising the moral principles that might have sustained them through their original imprisonment and escape attempts. Theft, smuggling, and other criminal enterprises provided income and access to resources that were otherwise unavailable to people without legitimate identities or employment histories. But participation in these activities also brought former prisoners into contact with criminal networks that might betray them to authorities in exchange for rewards or legal immunity. The constant tension between survival and morality created internal conflicts that many successful escapees never fully resolved, as they struggled to reconcile the person they had been before their imprisonment with the hardened survivor they had become during their captivity and the careful actor they needed to be in their new lives. The skills that had enabled them to survive prison and execute successful escapes, including deception, violence, and ruthless pragmatism, were often incompatible with the peaceful, law-abiding existence they hoped to achieve in their freedom, creating psychological dissonance that could manifest in depression, rage, or self-destructive behaviors that threatened to expose their true identities. Physical health problems resulting from their imprisonment often required ongoing medical attention that successful escapees could rarely risk seeking from legitimate physicians who might ask questions about the origins of their injuries or report suspicious cases to local authorities. Broken bones that had healed improperly, infections that had never been properly treated, and nutritional deficiencies that had caused permanent damage all continued to affect former prisoners long after their escape, sometimes creating disabilities that made normal work impossible while also serving as identifying marks that could lead to their recognition and recapture. The development of new identities required more than simply adopting different names and creating false personal histories, demanding that successful escapees learn to suppress the mannerisms, speech patterns, and behavioral habits they had developed during their previous lives and imprisonment. Regional accents, religious practices, professional knowledge, and social customs all had to be carefully modified or completely abandoned to avoid arousing suspicion in communities where former prisoners hoped to build new lives, a process that often felt like a form of voluntary erasure of their authentic selves. Memory management became a crucial survival skill for successful escapees, who had to learn to compartmentalize traumatic experiences from their imprisonment while also maintaining access to practical knowledge and survival skills they had developed during their captivity. Many former prisoners reported experiencing intrusive flashbacks, nightmares, and dissociative episodes that could occur without warning and potentially expose their true identities if they occurred in public settings where their reactions might be observed and questioned by suspicious neighbors or authorities. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life created recurring periods of increased danger for successful escapees, as harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days brought together large crowds that included travelers, merchants, and officials who might recognize fugitives or carry information about ongoing manhunts to areas that had previously seemed safe. Some former prisoners developed elaborate strategies for avoiding these high-risk periods, temporarily relocating to more remote areas, or finding ways to remain indoors and invisible during events that might increase their exposure to potential recognition. The aging process presented unique challenges for successful escapees, as physical changes over time might make their original identifying features less recognizable, while also creating new vulnerabilities that could expose them to discovery. Older former prisoners might find it increasingly difficult to maintain the physical capabilities required for emergency flight if their identities were discovered, while also facing greater risks of serious illness that could force them to seek medical attention despite the dangers involved in exposing themselves to official scrutiny. Some successful escapees reached points in their lives where the constant stress of maintaining false identities and avoiding detection became more burdensome than their original imprisonment had been, leading them to consider voluntary surrender as a form of relief from the psychological torture of perpetual fear and isolation that had defined their freedom. Chapter 9. Life After Prison. The underground networks that connected successful escapees with prisoners still trapped in medieval dungeons represented some of the most dangerous and sophisticated criminal organizations of their time, operating with levels of secrecy, coordination, and mutual support that rivaled the intelligence networks employed by nobles and religious authorities who were constantly searching for evidence of organized resistance to their control systems. These networks required former prisoners to balance their desire to help others achieve freedom against the enormous personal risks involved in maintaining contact with active escape operations that could expose them to renewed pursuit and capture by authorities who never stopped searching for prisoners who had successfully evaded their justice systems. The process of building new lives while constantly looking over their shoulders created unique psychological challenges for successful escapees who had to learn to function in normal society while suppressing the hypervigilance, paranoia, and survival instincts that had enabled them to survive their imprisonment and escape attempts. Many former prisoners found it impossible to sleep soundly, eat regular meals, or trust other people, their minds permanently altered by experiences that had required constant alertness and readiness for violence or flight. The simple act of walking through populated areas could trigger panic attacks as former prisoners instinctively scanned crowds for potential threats, searched for escape routes, and prepared for the pursuit they expected would eventually find them. Employment opportunities for successful escapees were severely limited by both their physical conditions and the need to avoid occupations that might expose them to official scrutiny or bring them into contact with authorities who might recognize them or become suspicious of their backgrounds. Many former prisoners were forced to accept work that paid poorly and offered no security, laboring in conditions that were often as harsh as their original captivity, but without the hope for escape that had sustained them through their imprisonment. Agricultural work in remote areas provided relative safety from discovery, but required physical capabilities that many former prisoners no longer possessed due to permanent damage from torture, malnutrition, and the effects of prolonged confinement. The social isolation experienced by successful escapees was often as devastating as their physical hardships, since they could never risk forming close relationships that might lead to questions about their backgrounds or create emotional attachments that could be used against them if their true identities were discovered. Many former prisoners reported feeling more alone after their escape than they had felt during their imprisonment, when they had at least shared their suffering with fellow inmates who understood their circumstances and could provide emotional support during the darkest periods of their captivity. Marriage and family life presented particular challenges for successful escapees, who had to decide whether to risk the emotional vulnerability of intimate relationships while knowing that discovery could endanger not only themselves, but also their spouses and children who might face punishment for harboring fugitives. Some former prisoners chose to remain celibate and solitary for the rest of their lives, viewing emotional connections as luxuries they could not afford, given the constant threat of discovery and recapture that hung over their existence. The financial resources required to maintain false identities and avoid detection often forced successful escapees into illegal activities that increased their risks of exposure, while also compromising the moral principles that might have sustained them through their original imprisonment and escape attempts. Theft, smuggling, and other criminal enterprises provided income and access to resources that were otherwise unavailable to people without legitimate identities or employment histories. But participation in these activities also brought former prisoners into contact with criminal networks that might betray them to authorities in exchange for rewards or legal immunity. The constant tension between survival and morality created internal conflicts that many successful escapees never fully resolved, as they struggled to reconcile the person they had been before their imprisonment with the hardened survivor they had become during their captivity, and the careful actor they needed to be in their new lives. The skills that had enabled them to survive prison and execute successful escapes, including deception, violence, and ruthless pragmatism, were often incompatible with the peaceful, law-abiding existence they hoped to achieve in their freedom, creating psychological dissonance that could manifest in depression, rage, or self-destructive behaviors that threatened to expose their true identities. Physical health problems resulting from their imprisonment often required ongoing medical attention that successful escapees could rarely risk seeking from legitimate physicians who might ask questions about the origins of their injuries or report suspicious cases to local authorities. Broken bones that had healed improperly, infections that had never been properly treated, and nutritional deficiencies that had caused permanent damage all continued to affect former prisoners long after their escape, sometimes creating disabilities that made normal work impossible while also serving as identifying marks that could lead to their recognition and recapture. The development of new identities required more than simply adopting different names and creating false personal histories, demanding that successful escapees learn to suppress the mannerisms, speech patterns, and behavioral habits they had developed during their previous lives in imprisonment. Regional accents, religious practices, professional knowledge, and social customs all had to be carefully modified or completely abandoned to avoid arousing suspicion in communities where former prisoners hoped to build new lives, a process that often felt like a form of voluntary erasure of their authentic selves. Memory management became a crucial survival skill for successful escapees, who had to learn to compartmentalize traumatic experiences from their imprisonment, while also maintaining access to practical knowledge and survival skills they had developed during their captivity. Many former prisoners reported experiencing intrusive flashbacks, nightmares, and dissociative episodes that could occur without warning and potentially expose their true identities if they occurred in public settings where their reactions might be observed and questioned by suspicious neighbors or authorities. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life created recurring periods of increased danger for successful escapees, as harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days brought together large crowds that included travelers, merchants, and officials who might recognize fugitives or carry information about ongoing manhunts to areas that had previously seemed safe. Some former prisoners developed elaborate strategies for avoiding these high-risk periods, temporarily relocating to more remote areas or finding ways to remain indoors and invisible during events that might increase their exposure to potential recognition. The aging process presented unique challenges for successful escapees, as physical changes over time might make their original identifying features less recognizable, while also creating new vulnerabilities that could expose them to discovery. Older former prisoners might find it increasingly difficult to maintain the physical capabilities required for emergency flight if their identities were discovered, while also facing greater risks of serious illness that could force them to seek medical attention despite the dangers involved in exposing themselves to official scrutiny. Some successful escapees reached points in their lives where the constant stress of maintaining false identities and avoiding detection became more burdensome than their original imprisonment had been, leading them to consider voluntary surrender as a form of relief from the psychological torture of perpetual fear and isolation that had defined their freedom. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Medieval Prison. The psychological burden of constant vigilance eventually convinced some successful escapees that death might be preferable to a lifetime of fear, isolation, and deception, leading them to make desperate choices that revealed the true cost of freedom achieved through resistance to medieval justice systems that were designed to make escape seem worse than continued captivity. However, their struggles and sacrifices contributed to evolutionary changes in prison design, security protocols, and criminal justice policies that would influence correctional systems for centuries to come, as authorities learned harsh lessons about the ingenuity and determination of prisoners who had nothing left to lose except their lives and their hope for freedom. The architectural innovations that emerged from medieval prison break attempts reflected a sophisticated understanding of the methods prisoners used to exploit structural weaknesses in existing facilities, leading to deliberate design changes that eliminated many of the vulnerabilities that had made earlier escapes possible. New prison construction incorporated features specifically intended to prevent the tunneling, climbing, and lock-picking techniques that had proven successful in previous escape attempts, with builders paying particular attention to drainage systems, ventilation passages, and maintenance access points that prisoners had exploited to reach areas beyond their intended confinement. Security protocol development became increasingly sophisticated as authorities analyzed successful and unsuccessful escape attempts to identify patterns that could be used to predict and prevent future attempts before prisoners had opportunities to execute their plans. Guard rotation schedules were modified to eliminate the predictable patterns that prisoners had used to time their escape attempts, while surveillance methods were enhanced to detect the subtle signs of escape preparation that had previously gone unnoticed until attempts were already in progress. The psychological warfare aspects of medieval prison management evolved to incorporate lessons learned about the mental resilience that enabled some prisoners to maintain hope and planning capabilities despite horrific conditions designed to break their spirits completely. Authorities developed more sophisticated methods of identifying prisoners who possessed the leadership qualities, technical skills or psychological strength that made them potential escape organizers. Implementing targeted interventions designed to eliminate these individuals before they could influence other inmates or develop the networks necessary for coordinated escape attempts. Information management systems were enhanced to improve communication between different prison facilities and jurisdictions, creating networks that allowed authorities to share intelligence about escape methods, prisoner backgrounds, and security vulnerabilities that might be exploited by inmates who possessed specific knowledge or skills. These early forms of criminal justice databases enabled more effective tracking of prisoners who had previous escape attempts or connections to individuals who had successfully evaded recapture, allowing authorities to implement preventive measures before new attempts could be organized. The legal frameworks that governed pursuit operations and punishment protocols were refined to close loopholes that successful escapees had exploited to reach sanctuary or evade recapture, while also establishing more standardized procedures for investigating escape attempts and identifying the support networks that had enabled prisoners to plan and execute their attempts. These legal developments reflected growing recognition that successful prison breaks represented threats not just to individual facilities, but to the entire social order that depended on the perception that justice was inevitable and resistance was futile. The training programs developed for prison guards and pursuit specialists incorporated practical knowledge gained from analyzing both successful and unsuccessful escape attempts, teaching personnel to recognize the warning signs of escape preparation, while also providing them with improved methods for tracking fugitives and preventing recapture attempts. These specialized training programs evolved into comprehensive educational systems that transformed medieval corrections from crude systems of containment into more sophisticated operations that incorporated psychological manipulation, architectural engineering, and coordinated intelligence-gathering methods that would remain influential long after the medieval period had ended and new forms of criminal justice had emerged to replace the brutal but often ineffective methods that had characterized earlier approaches to prisoner management and control. The institutional knowledge that developed from centuries of dealing with escape attempts created a foundation for modern correctional science that continues to influence prison design, security protocols, and prisoner management techniques in contemporary criminal justice systems around the world. The documentation and analysis of medieval prison breaks contributed to broader understanding of human psychology under extreme stress, providing insights into the mental processes that enable some individuals to maintain hope and planning capabilities even under conditions designed to break their spirits completely, while also revealing the social and political factors that influence prisoner behavior and the effectiveness of different deterrent strategies. This knowledge proved valuable not only for improving prison security, but also for understanding the broader dynamics of resistance, rebellion, and social control that govern relationships between authorities and subject populations in various historical and cultural contexts. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval responses to prison breaks established precedents for the continuous arms race between criminal ingenuity and security technology that characterizes modern correctional systems, where each new method of containment or surveillance generates corresponding innovations in escape techniques and resistance methods. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated locking mechanisms, architectural features designed to prevent climbing or tunneling, and surveillance methods that would evolve into the electronic monitoring systems and digital security networks that define contemporary prison management. The social impact of successful prison breaks extended far beyond the immediate effects on individual facilities or jurisdictions, influencing popular culture, political discourse, and legal philosophy in ways that shaped broader attitudes toward justice, punishment, and the limits of state authority over individual freedom. Stories of successful escapes became part of folk traditions that celebrated individual resistance to oppressive authority, while also serving as cautionary tales about the costs of defying established order, creating complex cultural narratives that continue to influence contemporary discussions about criminal justice reform and prisoner rights. The economic consequences of medieval prison breaks drove innovations in resource allocation, staffing strategies, and cost-benefit analysis that established patterns for evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of correctional systems that remain relevant in modern debates about criminal justice policy and prison reform. The enormous costs associated with pursuit operations, enhanced security measures, and expanded punishment protocols forced medieval authorities to develop more systematic approaches to managing correctional resources while balancing public safety concerns against fiscal constraints that limited their ability to implement ideal security measures. The international implications of successful prison breaks that crossed jurisdictional boundaries contributed to the development of cooperative agreements between different political entities, establishing precedents for the extradition treaties and international law enforcement cooperation that characterize modern responses to transnational crime and fugitive pursuit operations that extend beyond national borders in contemporary global criminal justice systems. And that brings us to the end of our dark journey through the brutal reality of medieval prison escapes. The legacy of these desperate attempts at freedom continues to shape our understanding of human resilience and the eternal struggle between oppression and liberty. From the calculated risks taken in damp stone cells to the sophisticated pursuit systems that hunted escapees across kingdoms, we've explored how these medieval prison breaks influenced centuries of correctional evolution. The few prisoners who successfully escaped their stone tombs paid prices that extended far beyond their initial captivity, living lives defined by constant fear, isolation, and the weight of secrets that could never be shared. Yet their courage and ingenuity helped expose the vulnerabilities in systems designed to break human spirit, ultimately contributing to changes that would reshape how societies think about justice, punishment, and redemption. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of medieval history, make sure to subscribe to the Drowsy Historian for more forgotten stories that textbooks don't dare tell. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations into history's darkest corners, and let me know in the comments which aspect of medieval prison life you'd like us to investigate next. Share this video with fellow history lovers who appreciate the gritty truth behind sanitized historical narratives, and consider supporting our channel so we can continue bringing you these meticulously researched journeys into the past that mainstream historians often avoid. Until next time, sleep well knowing that the horrors we've discussed tonight belong to a distant past, but remember the lessons they teach us about the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. This has been the Drowsy Historian. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me in the darkness of history.